How's it going, everybody? It's me, Paul, and I just came back from banging Spider-Man's girlfriend, and today I had a thought. The MCU has definitely ruined Thor, just like they ruined the Hulk, and today I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about ideas that could fix him and make him better, just like the last video. But don't worry, this isn't going to be like a whole thing where I'm going to make a video for every single MCU character. I really don't care, to be honest. I still like the MCU, don't get me wrong, but I do think they failed in a lot of ways when it comes to adapting their characters from the comics. So I just want to talk about that. And before we get into that, don't forget to like and comment and subscribe, because if you don't, I don't really have a threat for that, but it'd make me happy if you do. You know, you want to make me happy. I want to make me happy. You want to see me smile. That's what you want. So please do it for me. Do it for me, baby. Please. Mwah. Love you. Now, Thor has been around for around the same length as the Hulk, so around 60 years. And throughout those 60 years, with the exception of like some runs in the 90s and some runs in the early 2010s, he's had a pretty consistent run throughout the years, and most of those runs have been pretty great. As I said, consistently good. But unfortunately, people still don't know how to adapt him. You'd think it'd be easy to adapt him with, you know, all those good runs, but that doesn't seem the case, especially when it comes to these films. They're very hit or miss, basically. In fact, the first film is basically the clear-cut definition of mid, because the first 20 minutes are actually pretty good, and it just kind of goes downhill once it becomes a boring fish out of water film with really lame sense of humor and lame characters all around. It sucks. I liked Tom Hiddleston as Loki, and I really like Chris Hemsworth as Thor, but for the most part, it's just a very lame film, very boring film, very much a 5 out of 10, a very mid film. I can see what it's trying to do. It's basically adapting the first couple of issues of Journey into Mystery, where Thor comes from. But unfortunately, they don't adapt it very well, because in the comics, Thor loses his memory as well as his powers and becomes a doctor named Donald Blake. And, you know, they made a little, like, nod to that when Thor puts on a shirt. But for the most part, it's not a very direct adaptation and not a very faithful adaptation. You know, that's fine with me. Not every adaptation needs to be super faithful, especially when it comes to comics, where comics are basically mythology, and you can have your own, like, interpretation of comic characters. But I feel like the way the story is told in the comic is much more deeper and complex than what it was in the film. In the film, Thor is still Thor. He just doesn't have any powers, and it's just him being goofy and silly on Earth and New Mexico. But in the comics, he's an actual guy with his own feelings and stuff like that, until he finds out that he has superpowers and that his father basically sent him to Earth to learn humility, and that's exactly what Thor does. And that's the entire point of Thor, a giant powerful character, a literal god, learning how to be amongst men, and that's literally the point of his character. And they kind of do that with the first film, but I feel like it's not as effective, unfortunately. Also, as I said, the entire human stuff, very boring. All the human characters, very boring. And yeah, that's basically the entire summation of the entire film. Very much a 5 out of 10. And then he appears in the Avengers, which, very cool. He gets to fight Iron Man and some aliens, but he doesn't really have a lot to do other than that. Like, he fights Loki for a little bit and tries to send him home, but for the most part, I don't think he has a lot to do the last time I checked. Like, he does look cool, and it's cool to see him with the rest of the characters, but unlike Tony and Captain America, who I feel gets most of the spotlight because they're probably the most interesting characters in the MCU, for the most part, Thor gets sidelined because, well, there's a lot of characters and you can't, you know, give them all similar screen time. So at this point, he's just the stronger man who fights monsters and stuff like that, along with the Hulk. So it's unfortunate, but at least it's way more entertaining than his first film, which is also unfortunate because you'd think his first film would also be entertaining since he's a fantasy character, and fantasy is really fun, but that just isn't the case. And then the second film came out, and it was fucking terrible. It was very boring, very bland. I nearly forgot everything about the plot. But we all know what happens. He fights dark elves, and he gets the reality stone, and that's basically it. As I said, it's a very boring film. I don't like it very much, and I don't want to talk about it. I should talk about the Dark Elves. In the comics, the Dark Elves are actually threatening, and Malekith, especially, is super threatening. He's probably one of the worst Thor villains ever. He's done some pretty messed up shit to Thor. But in here, he just kills Thor's mom. In fact, he doesn't even kill his mom. Some dude kills the mom, and he just, you know, kind of comes in, scowls at Thor, and then leaves. And that's basically all of his character, and that's really lame because, as I said before, Malekith is actually a really interesting villain. He's like super fucking evil, And you think they could, make him a bit more interesting than just mopey and slightly irritated at everybody. But I guess that's just the entire summation of that film. Next up, we got Avengers Age of Ultron. And if you think Thor didn't have a lot to do in the first Avengers film, he definitely doesn't have a lot to do in this one. He just kind of does stuff. He kind of fights robots and guys. And then he parties with the Avengers, and then he fucking dips after fighting more robots. And that's basically what he does. He's not very interesting, and he's not very complex in this film. And I guess that's fine for some people. At least he's doing something way more interesting than just, staring off into the distance like he did in the last film. But, it's better than nothing, I suppose. Also, this entire film was a giant disappointment, just like Thor in this movie. So it doesn't really matter. And then we finally get Thor Ragnarok, which was a much-needed breath of fresh air. But unfortunately, it's not a very good Thor film. It's a very good movie. It's a very good comedy film. I would give you that, and I laughed a lot. But it's not a very good Thor adaptation. And as I said before, not every adaptation needs to be, totally faithful to the source material. Because, as I said before, comics are basically mythology. You can basically make any interpretation your interpretation, and that wouldn't matter because that's just how comics are. But even then, I just feel like they went a bit too far with the comedy and aspects of these films. And I get why, because the last two films are so fucking bland and nobody liked it. It was nobody's favorite film that they had to go the other way in order to make the character somewhat interesting. But the only thing they did is just make him sort of goofy clown character that does some cool stuff. Like the whole fight on the Rainbow Bridge was really cool, and how he gains basically Super Saiyan powers was also pretty fucking sick. But for the most part, it's mostly just a straight up comedy, and it's not a very good adaptation of the Ragnarok storyline, which is a very dark and very messed up shit that happens in a comic where Thor basically rests for 7 years, both in canon and outside of canon with the comics, because the Thor comics go on hiatus for 7 or so years. He doesn't come back until 2008. So yeah, that was pretty crazy what happened. He also gained even more power in the comics in order to stop Ragnarok. It was an entire thing, but yeah, it's not a very good adaptation of the Ragnarok stuff. Also, Hela was the main villain. I liked Hela a lot. She was way more interesting, if not as complex as Malekith. In the comics, she's either Thor's niece or something else entirely. She has a very weird backstory. Sometimes she's Loki's daughter, sometimes she's something else entirely. I'm not really angry at the fact that she's Thor's sister in these films because honestly her backstory in the comics is very complicated and it doesn't really matter all that much. At least she was interesting to watch, and I really like Kate Blanchett as Hela, so that was nice to see. For the most part, as I said, good film, really bad Thor adaptation. Wish they went a little bit more serious, but I can see where they were going. And then we had Thor in Avengers Infinity War, and this was peak Thor. Thor throwing the axe at Thanos' chest would never not be cool. Him coming into the battlefield with Stormbreaker was pretty fucking sick. Everything about Thor in that movie was awesome. Unfortunately, as I said before, this is peak Thor, and it kind of goes downhill after this. We all know what happens afterwards. He becomes basically Big Lebowski, and then he becomes a total fucking joke in Thor Love and Thunder. Also, fun fact, Stormbreaker is actually Beta Ray Bill's hammer. In the comics, Beta Ray Bill was basically like an alien cyborg who was given the powers of Thor by Odin. It's really fucking cool, and I'm also honestly pretty glad that he isn't in the comics because they probably ruined him too, unfortunately. But yeah, that hammer technically isn't his. But yeah, other than that, very cool in Avengers Infinity War, very lame in Avengers Endgame, and super fucking lame in Thor Love and Thunder. I don't really need to talk about Thor Love and Thunder. What's been said has already been said. There's tons of videos about Thor Love and Thunder being shit. But basically, they took everything that was good about Jason Aaron's run and somehow made it super shit. Gorr the God Butcher, shit. The whole quest to get his daughter back, shit. It was just very, very bad, unfortunately. And it's a super disappointment because the whole God Butcher arc was super fucking cool because Gorr didn't just want to kill gods that he just saw. He wanted to kill every single god that existed throughout time. The dude made a fucking bomb to kill all gods throughout time and history and shit like that. It was so bad that 3 different Thors from the different timelines had to come in to help the mainline Thor to kill Gorr. That's how bad it was. Also, Gorr was around when Thor was just a young god, and he nearly killed him when he was younger, so, there was some history between them, but now Gorr's just some guy that Thor knows about. Also, the All Black which is basically like pre-Venom in the comics, because there's this whole thing with the King in Black, but I'm not gonna get into that. The All Black was more than just a spooky sword that was able to kill gods. It had its own like history and whatnot. Unfortunately, it was also neutered, just like Gore. Also, who else was neutered? Christian Bale. He would have played a great Gore. Unfortunately, he was totally wasted in this film, just like everybody else, just like this entire film. But yeah, we all know how that ended up. Nobody really liked the film, and it's regarded as one of the worst films in the MCU, just like one of the other Thor films we just talked about. So yeah, that isn't going very well. Enough of the criticisms. This is a positive channel. I like to talk about positivity and, fighting against the odds. So let's talk about things that can probably fix Thor if they ever want to make a new movie. They probably won't, because the last movie was so hated that I don't think they ever want to make another Thor movie ever, unfortunately. And Chris Hemsworth doesn't seem to want to go back to playing Thor after that disaster. But hey, we could dream. So let's get into some steps, maybe some ideas on how to fix Thor. The first step is pretty obvious. Cut it with the jokes. Thor isn't a comedic character. He can have some comedic moments, but he isn't a fucking clown. He's a very serious character, and his storylines are very serious and sometimes super fucking dark. Like the whole Fear itself storyline was a very dark storyline where Thor faces off against the god of fear. So that was pretty fucking terrible. Also, the original Ragnarok storyline, the Mangog storylines. If you ever know about Mangog, he's probably one of the most, ruthless Thor villains ever. And I'm also sort of glad that he didn't appear in the comics, because he'd probably just be some big dumb monster instead of the like biblical fucking being that the character is supposed to be in the comics. But maybe if they ever wanted to adapt another Thor film, maybe bring in the Mangog and bring in somebody who's actually a threat against Thor, and not some goofy villain who wants to bring back his daughter. Something much more threatening than that, hopefully. And that's another thing. Better villains. Other than Hela, Thor has kept the MCU tradition of having really bad villains. And that's unfortunate, because as I said before, Thor has some of the worst villains ever. Malekith was one of them, Gore the God Butcher, and as I said before, Mangog, who is probably one of the worst villains to ever exist, because it is not just a villain. It is a monster made up of 1 million souls that Odin killed years ago, and it has a deep hatred for the gods. He's basically Gore, but on steroids. He's basically Gore if Gore was mixed up with the fucking Hulk. That is how bad the Mangog is. And yeah, it'd be cool if they brought him into the movies, because he's one of the most intimidating, most evil characters to ever exist in the Thor mythos. So yeah, make some better villains, make them interesting, and if not interesting, make them complex or whatever, or do it the other way around. I don't care. Just do something with the characters, because these villains ain't in, unfortunately. Finally, step 3, make the side characters interesting. The last time we had side characters, they all died and nobody fucking cared, which is sad, because Thor has some pretty interesting side characters. The Warriors 3 are a pretty nice comedic trio, and bring some levity to the Thor mythos. And they're also like cool. They bring some lore into the characters. There are also some like other races that Thor hangs out with, like the dwarves and the elves that are around, that he even makes up a team with, called like I think the Guardians of the Realms or whatever. They're very cool. You could probably bring them in. They could probably be interesting or something. Like, just do something with the side characters other than just fucking killing them off. And stop bringing fucking Valkyrie in. She's not very interesting, and she's very annoying. So stop bringing her into every single thing, because we don't like him. Nobody likes her. She was cool in the comics, but unfortunately, when it comes to adapting stuff, they don't like to adapt the cool parts. Or at least if they do adapt the cool parts, they don't adapt it very well. So, like, bring in some cool characters from the comics. Finally, turn Thor into a fantasy character. Like, enough with this like low fantasy or urban fantasy setting that we've had every single Thor film, where he's either mostly on Earth or he doesn't fight many cool monsters and stuff like that. Make him into like an alien character or whatever, or bring him into space, or do something cool with him that doesn't involve Earth. Like, they tried to do that with Thor Ragnarok and Thor Love and Thunder, but because they made it so comedic, it didn't really matter, at least not to me. But like, make him a bit more of a dark fantasy character. Make him more like Game of Thrones-esque and less like Willow or something along those lines. Just make it fucking cool. Like, let him fight giant monsters and evil elves and dragons and shit like that. Just make him a cool action hero. Don't make him into a comedic hero and shit like that. So yeah, that's basically it for me when it comes to those ideas. There's probably more that I probably could have said that I haven't thought of right now off the top of my head. Can you tell these are unscripted? But yeah, comment down below, what are your ideas to make a good Thor film? I like to hear it. I like to read it, not hear it. But yeah, Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.